Welcome back to Psychology 36, Psychotic Disorders, video 2. When we left off of video 1, we were talking about early indicators of schizophrenia. Now, one of the things to remember with the early indicators of schizophrenia is that these are not guarantees that the person has schizophrenia or will have schizophrenia when they get older. These are just sort of common things that we've seen, common patterns that we've seen. So when we're working with somebody with schizophrenia or talking to the family member of somebody that has full-blown schizophrenia, what we'll do is we'll sort of do this regression analysis. Makes it sound a lot more formal, but we'll ask them, what were they like as a child? And they typically identify these things. Well, they were always quiet and withdrawn. They really didn't like to hang out in big groups of people. They tended to be more sensitive. And looking back, they never had a steady relationship. And these are sort of common themes that we've seen. But again, there are many, many people that exhibit these things in childhood that don't turn out to suffer with schizophrenia when they get older. It's just one of the things that we've seen when we're talking about people or when we're working with people who are suffering with schizophrenia when they get older. Okay, now the sort of worst of the worst, schizoaffective disorder. So this is a different psychotic disorder than schizophrenia. In my experience anyway, and other people might argue something different, but if you're talking about pure psychological disorders, schizoaffective disorder is the worst of the worst when it comes to mental illness. It really, really is. If you want to understand schizoaffective disorder, the best way to think about it is a combination of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Now, this is going to get a little bit complicated, but I'll see if we can make this make sense. People with schizophrenia have psychosis all the time. They don't have any mood symptoms, right? So they don't have the mood swings that people with bipolar would have. They don't have the mania or the depression. People with depression can have psychosis, if you remember back to that, but only when they're depressed. Okay, so they might have some psychotic symptoms when they're very, very depressed. They might see things, hear things that aren't there. They might have delusions, again, but only when they're depressed. When the depression goes away, the delusions are gone. Okay, people with bipolar disorder might have some delusions and hallucinations. They might have some psychosis, but only when they're either manic or depressed. But as soon as the mood symptoms go away, as soon as the mania goes away, as soon as the depression goes away, the mood symptoms are gone. Okay, sorry, not the psychosis is gone. Okay, there's no psychosis when they're not experiencing the mood symptoms. People with schizophrenia, as I said before, have psychosis all the time, but no mood symptoms. Schizoaffective disorder is basically a combination of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, if you want to conceptualize it that way. It's people that have psychosis all the time, and they have the mania and depression of bipolar disorder. So basically, if you control one, you still have the other to contend with. So if you give mood-stabilizing medications to control the mood symptoms, you still have psychosis. So you're basically treating both. And if you control the psychosis, the person still has mood symptoms. So they're really battling, in essence, what ends up being two different disorders at the same time, but they're kind of co-occurring. And the way to diagnose schizoaffective disorder is if they're psychotic when they're manic and or depressed, and the psychosis stays when they're not manic or depressed. Okay? And it really is a terribly devastating disorder. And the medications for this disorder are not great at all. They all have side effects. Medications for bipolar disorder have side effects. Medications for psychosis have side effects. And then you basically just give them both types of medication. Patients with schizoaffective disorder come in and they usually have a laundry list of medications that they're taking. And they're usually very sedated, very lethargic. They just don't look well, even on their best day. Schizoaffective disorder tends to be very, very rare. But if you look at the symptoms, they're broken down here. Major depressive or manic episode accompanied with symptoms of schizophrenia, positive and or negative. And at some point, the delusions must be present for 2 weeks. And this is not caused by alcohol and or drugs. Okay, these patients tend to be suffering terribly. It's awful. Not that patients with schizophrenia don't suffer, but this tends to be sort of the worst of the worst in my experience. Okay, delusional disorder is a psychotic disorder, but the only symptom is delusions. Okay, the person will have delusions. They might believe that their body is infested with insects. So they have this sort of belief. They don't see the insects. They don't feel the insects on their body, because once they see them or feel them, that becomes a hallucination, because that's a sensory stimulus. If they just believe that they're there but don't feel anything different, then that's going to be a delusion. Okay, the person's behavior is not markedly impaired or odd or bizarre, unlike people with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. They just have these very, very strongly held false beliefs. I will tell you, delusional disorder is rare. I've never seen a patient with pure delusional disorder. And this could be because their behavior is not that interrupted by the delusions. And if that's the case, they wouldn't come into a hospital or come into an outpatient setting for the most part, because nobody would be forcing them to go there. So they wouldn't really be seen very frequently in hospital settings or outpatient settings. But I've seen hundreds and hundreds of patients at this point, and delusional disorder is one of the few disorders that we'll talk about that I haven't actually seen in person. Now, origins of psychological disorders, more particularly schizophrenia. There are different beliefs and different ideas as far as where these disorders come from. And the science on this is evolving and progressing every day. The truth is, we really don't know where they come from. We know that there's a strong genetic component. We know that, but it's not 100% caused by genetics. There's other factors involved when we're talking about psychotic disorders. Okay, there's a few different things going on. Genetics, we know that genetics can contribute. If you look at the numbers here, overall 1% of the population has it. If you have a first-degree relative, mother, father, sister, brother, son, or daughter, that has schizophrenia, the likelihood that you have it or will develop it are about 10 to 15%, so it's a lot higher. Fraternal twins that aren't identical, it's also 15%. Identical twins are 50%. And this right here is the number that tells you that there's a strong genetic component, but it's not all genetics. Since identical twins share genetics, that means if it's purely genetic, it should be 100%. If one twin has it, the other one has to have it, if it's only genetic. But since only 50% of the time, if one is diagnosed, the other one will be diagnosed, it means there has to be at least a 50% environmental contribution. And we don't know what that is. It could be stress, it could be environmental stimuli, it could be different social groups, it could be a virus. We have no idea. We really don't know. It could be bacteria. There's so many different things that it could be, and we really don't know what the answer is, and it's difficult to speculate. There's some research where they're trying to see if viruses that the mother contracted during pregnancy could contribute. They're trying to see if environmental stressors can contribute to the development of schizophrenia. We don't really know. But at the end of the day, schizophrenia, we know that there's a strong genetic component, but it's not only genetic. Okay. Adoption studies, you can sort of read this on its own. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it basically talks about again, partly the impact of genetics on the development of schizophrenia and environmental influences on schizophrenia. Okay. In research that we've done, we know that people that have too much dopamine tend to exhibit more positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and people with lower levels of dopamine tend to exhibit negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Again, it's correlational data. We don't know necessarily if increasing or decreasing dopamine will contribute to schizophrenia, but we do know that people with high levels of dopamine tend to have more positive symptoms, and lower levels of dopamine tend to have more negative symptoms. Okay. Other things that we know that people who suffer with schizophrenia tend to have. There are ventricles in the brain, openings in the brain filled with fluid, and it seems that people with schizophrenia tend to have larger ventricles for the most part, and people with larger ventricles tend to have more negative symptoms of schizophrenia. We don't know why. We don't have any idea. I did have a friend who was working at a pharmaceutical company, and their belief was that the pharmaceutical company's stance was that schizophrenia is caused by excessive pruning. I'll explain that really briefly, but pruning is a normal process in where brain cells that aren't used die off from lack of use. It's normal. Everybody goes through pruning. It's biologically determined. It's normal. There's nothing wrong with this. But pruning tends to slow down or even stop as we get older. The pharmaceutical company believed that schizophrenia was caused by pruning that didn't stop when it was supposed to, and they were trying to make medications that stopped the pruning process if it was happening and it shouldn't have been happening. I don't know what happened with the research. She left the pharmaceutical company to do other things. I don't know what happened with that. I don't know what relationships they found, but as far as I know, there's been no new medication related to that. So who knows? It could still be in clinical trials. It might not have gotten anywhere, but that's what she was saying. So that's just another theory on where schizophrenia comes from. Okay. You know, there is some connection. I talked about the idea of viruses before. There is some connection between the mother developing a flu during pregnancy and the child developing schizophrenia. Children who tend to develop schizophrenia later tend to not have sort of fluid eye movements if you watch, you know, if you put your finger in front of their eyes and then move back and forth. But again, this is not causal. It's just things that we've seen that tend to be common in people that are suffering with schizophrenia. But again, it's not causal. Okay. One big thing that I'm going to stress a little bit here is something called the diathesisstress model. Okay, the diathesisstress model is a general model that's used in medicine nowadays and in the biological sciences nowadays to try to explain the combination of genetic causes and environmental causes. Basically, what the diathesisstress model, or stress diathesis model, two different ways of saying the same thing, believe is that you need two things in order for a disorder to be present. You, number one, need the genes, the biology. So diathesis refers to biology, the genetic predisposition. And then you also need an environmental influence. Okay, so I'll use the example of smoking to explain this. So there's some people who smoke and who get lung cancer. There's some people who smoke and don't get lung cancer. Then there's also some people who don't smoke and get lung cancer. And then there's obviously other people who don't smoke and don't get lung cancer. Okay, for the people who smoke and get lung cancer, the diathesis they're going to argue is going to be the genes for lung cancer, and the stress is the environmental stress, the stress of smoking. You put those two together and the person will develop lung cancer. That also explains why there's certain people who smoke and don't get lung cancer. So they have the environmental stress, the smoking, but they don't have the gene. So even if you present the environmental stress, they won't develop lung cancer. Okay, I'm simplifying this whole process, but it's just to make it make sense. People who don't smoke and don't get lung cancer, that makes sense. People who don't smoke and do get lung cancer, according to the diathesisstress, maybe there's other stressors on them. So they have the genes for this, but maybe there's other stressors, carbon monoxide, asbestos in the air, you know, whatever it could be. But these things would act as the environmental stress. In essence, the diathesisstress model argues that you need two different things to develop the disorder. And they use this to try to explain why some children who have parents who are suffering schizophrenia, or identical twins, where one child develops schizophrenia and the other one doesn't, they try to explain why. So they're going to argue, at least specifically with the identical twins, if one has schizophrenia, they both have the genes for it. But for one reason or another, one of them experienced the stress that triggered the schizophrenia gene, and the other one didn't experience the stress. So if it's a virus, maybe one of them was exposed to the virus in the uterus and the other one wasn't. Maybe if it's environmental stress, one of them was stressed more when they were growing up and the other one wasn't. You have to remember that even identical twins don't share exactly the same environment, even if they're raised in the same household. They still experience different things. They have different friendship groups. Sometimes, you know, the parents will treat them differently, intentionally or unintentionally. They will experience different things. And something in the environment could be could be stressful enough to trigger that schizophrenia gene, assuming that there's a gene that causes schizophrenia. So it's probably a combination of multiple genes working together, but regardless, that's the diathesisstress model, and that's how they try to explain why certain things develop and don't develop, even if genetically you're similar or the same as somebody else. Okay, we know that there is a strong connection between other things, poverty and schizophrenia, which poverty could act as an environmental stress, and if you're thinking in terms of diathesisstress, this could certainly contribute to schizophrenia. Nature perspective, the disorder could make it difficult to work, so people can become poor and homeless. So basically what this is saying is that it's not poverty that causes schizophrenia, it's that schizophrenia could contribute to poverty. The nurture perspective, and meaning the environment contributes, it could be that the stress of poverty and homelessness activate the schizophrenia gene. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I will make a couple more videos as the semester goes, but I hope I made this more clear.